What would you do if you were sentenced to 15 years in prison for a murder you didn't commit? What would you do if the person who actually killed someone was sitting at your trial, watching you get convicted, never saying a word? What would you do if your own family believed you were guilty? If everyone you loved turned their backs on you? If the justice system failed you so completely that you lost 8 years of your life to a cell you should never have been in? And what would you do if the only person who believed in your innocence was your 12-year-old brother, who promised, as they led you away in handcuffs, that he'd find a way to bring you home? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 34 years old, and I spent 8 years in a maximum security women's prison in upstate New York for a murder I didn't commit. I was convicted of killing my wealthy Aunt Margaret by pushing her down the stairs of her mansion during what prosecutors called a violent argument over inheritance. The media painted me as a greedy, entitled niece who murdered her aunt for money. My own mother testified against me. My father refused to visit me in prison. Extended family members gave interviews calling me a monster. I lost everything: my freedom, my reputation, my family, my future. But I didn't lose my brother. Ethan was 12 years old when I was arrested, 14 when I was convicted, and 22 when he walked into that prison with a briefcase full of evidence that would change both our lives forever. He'd spent a decade becoming the thing I needed most, a lawyer who knew exactly how to dismantle the case that destroyed me, and more importantly, a brother who'd never stopped believing that I was innocent and that our Uncle Richard, the beloved family patriarch, was actually the murderer who let me take the fall. This is the story of how I lost 8 years of my life to a crime I didn't commit, how my little brother dedicated his entire adolescence and young adulthood to saving me, and how we exposed a killer who'd hidden in plain sight for a decade, while everyone praised him for being such a supportive family member during a tragic situation. This is about injustice, loyalty, betrayal, and the lengths one person will go to save someone they love. And this is about how the justice system can fail so catastrophically that an innocent woman goes to prison while the actual murderer attends her trial and shakes hands with the prosecutors afterward. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the night everything changed, the night my Aunt Margaret died and my entire life was destroyed in the process. It was October 15th, 2006. I was 26 years old, working as a graphic designer in Manhattan, living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, dating a guy named Tom who I thought I might marry someday. I had a good life, nothing spectacular but comfortable and happy. I was close with my younger brother Ethan, saw my parents regularly, had a decent relationship with extended family, even though we weren't super close. Normal life, normal problems, normal happiness. My Aunt Margaret was my father's older sister, a wealthy widow who lived alone in a massive Victorian mansion in Westchester County that she'd inherited from her late husband Charles. She was 72 years old, sharp as a tack, opinionated and sometimes difficult, but generally kind to me. We weren't extremely close, but we got along fine. I'd visit her maybe once every few months, usually with my parents, for family dinners or holidays. She had no children of her own, and there'd been some family speculation over the years about who she'd leave her considerable estate to when she died, but it wasn't something I thought about much. I certainly never expected or felt entitled to any of her money. The night she died, I'd gone to visit her alone. She'd called me that afternoon asking if I could stop by that evening, said she wanted to talk to me about something important. I was curious but not concerned. Aunt Margaret sometimes liked to have these one-on-one conversations with various family members where she'd dispense advice or opinions about their lives. I figured it was something like that. I arrived at her house around 7 in the evening. It was already dark, October darkness that falls early and feels heavy. The mansion was lit up inside, warm light glowing from the windows, looking beautiful and slightly imposing the way old Victorian houses do. I knocked, she answered, invited me in with a smile, offered me tea. Everything seemed normal. We sat in her formal living room, the one with the expensive furniture and the portrait of Uncle Charles over the fireplace. She poured tea, asked about my work, my relationship with Tom, normal small talk. Then her expression changed, became more serious. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about Richard," she said, referring to my Uncle Richard, her younger brother, and my father's younger brother. "I've discovered something disturbing, and I don't know what to do about it." Uncle Richard was 58 at the time, a successful commercial real estate developer, married to my Aunt Linda with 2 adult children of his own. He was generally well-liked in the family, the fun uncle who told jokes and picked up the tab at family dinners, who seemed generous and warm and successful. "What about Uncle Richard?" I asked, not particularly worried. I figured it was some family drama, maybe a disagreement about something. "He's been stealing from me," Aunt Margaret said bluntly. "For years, significant amounts of money. I only discovered it recently when I was reviewing some financial documents with my accountant. He's had access to one of my accounts as a trustee, and he's been systematically embezzling funds. We're talking about over $2 million over the past 5 years." I stared at her, shocked. "Are you sure? Maybe there's been a mistake." "There's no mistake. I've had it verified. I confronted him about it this afternoon. He came here and I showed him the evidence. He admitted it, Sarah. Admitted he'd been taking the money, said he'd been having financial problems with his business and borrowed from my accounts, planning to pay it back, but never did." She was shaking slightly, upset. "I told him I was going to report it to the police, that what he'd done was theft regardless of our family relationship. He begged me not to, said it would destroy him, destroy his family, that he'd pay it all back. But I can't let this go. He stole from me. He violated my trust." "What did he say when you told him you were reporting it?" "He got angry, started making threats, saying I'd regret it, that he'd make sure I regretted humiliating him. Then he left. That was around 5 this afternoon. And now I'm frightened, Sarah. Richard has always had a temper under that charming exterior. I'm worried about what he might do." I felt a chill. "Have you called the police?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, get your advice. You're level-headed and I trust your judgment. Should I report this tonight? Should I wait until morning and contact my attorney first? I just don't know the right way to handle this." We talked for about 30 minutes about her options, about what reporting it would mean for Uncle Richard and for the family. I encouraged her to contact her attorney first thing in the morning and let them guide the process of reporting it properly. She seemed relieved to have a plan, thanked me for listening, for being someone she could trust. I left around 8:15, gave her a hug, told her to call me if she needed anything, to make sure all her doors and windows were locked, given Uncle Richard's threats. She promised she would be careful. I drove home to Brooklyn thinking about how shocking it was that Uncle Richard had been stealing from his own sister, wondering how this would affect family dynamics, but not overly worried beyond that. The next morning, I woke up to 10 missed calls from my mother. Before I could call back, there was pounding on my apartment door. I opened it to find 2 NYPD detectives with grim expressions. "Sarah Mitchell? We need you to come with us. Your Aunt Margaret Whitmore was found dead this morning. We have some questions for you." The world tilted. Dead? Aunt Margaret was dead. How? What happened? They took me to the police station, put me in an interrogation room, and that's when my nightmare truly began. They told me Aunt Margaret had been found at the bottom of her grand staircase that morning by her housekeeper. She died from massive head trauma consistent with falling down the stairs. But it wasn't being investigated as an accident. There were signs of a struggle at the top of the stairs, and based on evidence they'd found, they believed she'd been pushed. And I was their primary suspect. "You were the last person to see her alive," the detective said, a hard-faced woman named Detective Morrison. "Her housekeeper says you visited last night and left around 8:15. Margaret was found dead at the bottom of the stairs around 9 this morning. You want to tell us what really happened during that visit?" "We just talked. We had tea. I left and she was fine." "Fine?" Witnesses say you and Margaret had disputes about money, that you expected to inherit from her and were angry she'd recently changed her will. What? That's not true. I never expected anything from her. Really? Because we found a draft will from 3 months ago leaving her entire estate to you, but last month she changed it, cut you out completely. That must have made you pretty angry. I was blindsided. I'd had no idea about any will, old or new. I didn't know about any will. We never discussed inheritance. They didn't believe me. They had a narrative and they twisted every answer I gave to fit it. The kind neighbor who'd seen me arrive and leave. The housekeeper who said Aunt Margaret had been worried about family pressures recently. The fact that I'd been there during the window when she died. The supposed motive of the changed will. I asked for a lawyer. They arrested me for second-degree murder. The next months were a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and complete destruction of my life as I knew it. The prosecutor, an ambitious man named Douglas Freeman, who would later run for district attorney on this case, built a circumstantial case that was devastatingly effective. Their theory was that I'd learned Aunt Margaret had removed me from her will, that I'd gone to her house that night to convince her to change it back, that we'd argued, that she'd pushed her down the stairs in anger and then fled. The changed will was the motive. My presence at her house that night was opportunity. Forensics found what they claimed were carpet fibers from the top of the stairs on my clothes, proving I'd been up there even though I'd claimed we'd only sat in the living room downstairs. I told them the truth, that we'd discussed Uncle Richard's theft, that Aunt Margaret had been planning to report him that very afternoon. But when police investigated Uncle Richard, he had a perfect alibi. He'd been at a business dinner with 12 other people from 6 p.m. until after midnight that night. Multiple witnesses, credit card receipts from the restaurant, even security footage showing him there. He couldn't have been at Aunt Margaret's house during the time she died. So they dismissed my claims as a desperate attempt to redirect blame. And worse, Uncle Richard played the devastated family member perfectly. He cried at the memorial service. He gave interviews about what a tragic situation it was, how he couldn't believe his beloved niece could have done something so terrible, how he'd always thought I was a good person and was shocked to learn what I was capable of. He was so convincing that even I almost believed him for a moment. My family fractured. My mother, devastated by the loss of her sister-in-law and convinced by the prosecutor's case, actually testified against me at trial. She talked about how I'd been difficult growing up, how I'd always wanted more than we could afford, how I'd asked about Aunt Margaret's will once at a family dinner years ago. Every innocent question or comment I'd ever made was reframed as evidence of greed and entitlement. My father attended the trial but wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't believe I was innocent, I could tell. He thought his daughter was a murderer and he couldn't reconcile that with the person he'd raised. My boyfriend Tom broke up with me 2 weeks after my arrest, said he couldn't be with someone accused of murder, that he didn't know who I really was. Most of my friends disappeared. A few stood by me at first, but as the evidence mounted and the media coverage intensified, they drifted away too. The only person who never wavered was Ethan, my 12-year-old brother who'd sit in the courtroom every single day of my trial, who'd write me letters in jail talking about school and his life, but always ending with, "I know you didn't do it, Sarah. I know you're innocent, and I'm going to help prove it someday." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was strong, circumstantial, but compelling. My defense attorney, a public defender who was overwhelmed and underfunded, did his best but couldn't overcome the narrative. I testified in my own defense, told the truth about Uncle Richard's theft and Aunt Margaret's plans to report him, but without any evidence to support it and with his ironclad alibi, it sounded like a desperate lie. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. When they came back with a guilty verdict on second-degree murder, I felt my entire world collapse. 15 years to life, the judge said at sentencing. I was 26 years old, and my life was over. They took me to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, a maximum security women's prison about an hour north of New York City. My first night there, I cried until I vomited. I was in a cell with a woman named Rita who was serving 20 years for armed robbery. She told me to shut up and go to sleep, or she'd give me something to really cry about. I learned quickly that prison is exactly as terrible as you imagine, and worse in ways you can't anticipate. The loss of freedom, the dehumanization, the constant noise and lack of privacy, the violence that can erupt over nothing, the despair that settles into your bones when you realize this is your life now and might be forever. But the worst part was the isolation. My parents never visited. They'd effectively disowned me, couldn't bear to see the daughter they believed was a murderer. Extended family was the same. Friends stopped writing after a few months. Even Tom, who I'd thought loved me, had vanished completely. Ethan was the only one who never abandoned me. He visited as often as they'd allow, every 2 weeks without fail, even though it meant taking a bus from our hometown in New Jersey to the prison. He was 12, then 13, then 14, growing up during those early years of my incarceration, and I could see how it was affecting him. The other kids in his school knew his sister was in prison for murder. He got bullied, got into fights defending me, struggled in classes. Our parents were so consumed by their grief and shame that they barely noticed what was happening to their remaining child. But Ethan never complained about any of it during our visits. He'd tell me about school, about books he was reading, about saving money from his part-time job, and he'd always tell me he knew I was innocent. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said during one visit when he was 15. "I'm going to prove you didn't do it. Ethan, sweetie, I love you for believing in me, but the case is over. I've exhausted my appeals. There's nothing left to do." "Then I'll find something. I'll find what they missed. I promise you, Sarah, I'm going to bring you home." I didn't have the heart to tell him it was impossible. I just hugged him as tight as the guards would allow and cried into his shoulder. When Ethan was 16, he told me his plan. I wanted to tell him to live his life, to let go of this impossible mission, to not waste his youth trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. But the desperate, hopeful part of me clung to his words. Maybe it was possible. Maybe somehow there was a way out of this nightmare. Ethan kept his promise. He graduated high school a year early with perfect grades, got a full scholarship to NYU, majored in criminal justice, graduated summa cum laude, got into Columbia Law School, graduated in the top 10% of his class, passed the bar on his first attempt, all while visiting me every 2 weeks, spending every spare moment researching my case, filing Freedom of Information requests, teaching himself about forensics and criminal investigation. He was 22 when he finally came to visit me with that briefcase full of evidence. 8 years into my sentence, I'd stopped believing anything would change by then. I'd accepted that this was my life, that I'd serve my 15 years and get out when I was 41 and try to build some kind of existence from the ruins. I'd stopped hoping. Then Ethan sat across from me in that visiting room, opened his briefcase, and said 4 words that changed everything. "I found the proof." What proof? That Uncle Richard killed Aunt Margaret, that his alibi was fake, that he framed you. All of it, Sarah. I have proof of all of it. My heart started racing. How? His alibi was verified by 12 people. There's security footage. The alibi is real. He really was at that business dinner. But here's what the police never investigated thoroughly enough: the timeline. Aunt Margaret's time of death was estimated between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. based on the medical examiner's findings. But I got access to the full autopsy report through a FOIA request, and there were some inconsistencies that were never properly addressed. The ME noted that the body temperature and rigor mortis suggested she might have died earlier than initially estimated, possibly as early as 7:30 or 8 p.m., but that timeline didn't fit with you being the last person to see her alive at 8:15, so it was adjusted. But if she died earlier, Then Uncle Richard could have killed her before his business dinner. The restaurant where he had his alibi was only 20 minutes from Aunt Margaret's house. He could have killed her any time between 6:30, when he supposedly left after their confrontation about the theft, and 7:30, when the first guests arrived at the dinner. Then he'd be at the restaurant by 7:45, which is when the first credit card receipts show he was there. But wouldn't people have noticed if he seemed upset or disheveled? Not if he'd planned it carefully. And here's where it gets interesting. Ethan pulled out a document. I tracked down Aunt Margaret's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who found the body. She's retired now, living in California. I flew out there and interviewed her. She told me something she never told the police because they never asked the right questions. She said that when she arrived the morning after the murder, she noticed Uncle Richard's car was parked in the driveway. She assumed he'd come to check on the house after hearing about Margaret's death. But when I showed her the timeline, she realized he must have been there before the police even notified the family. How would he have known to go there unless he already knew she was dead? Did she testify to this? She was never called to testify about this because the police didn't consider it relevant. They'd already decided you were the killer. They did the bare minimum investigation into Uncle Richard because his alibi seemed solid. Ethan pulled out more documents. I also found financial records showing that Uncle Richard made several large cash deposits in the months after Aunt Margaret's death, supposedly from the sale of some assets, but the timeline is suspicious. And I found out that Aunt Margaret's actual will, the one that was executed after her death, left everything to Uncle Richard, not to you. The prosecutor's whole motive theory was based on a draft will that was never finalized. You were never actually cut out of anything because you were never actually in the will to begin with. The prosecutor said there was a will leaving everything to me. There was a draft. Just a draft that was never signed or witnessed, probably something Aunt Margaret was considering but never finalized. But the prosecutor presented it as if it was a real will that had been changed, making you seem like you had a motive. The jury never knew it was just a draft. I was shaking. Ethan, if all this is true, if you can prove this, I can. I've been building a case for 8 years. I have expert witnesses willing to testify that the time of death was likely earlier than estimated. I have Mrs. Chen willing to testify about the car. I have financial experts willing to show the suspicious deposits. I have investigators who found more evidence that the police missed because they stopped looking once they arrested you. He pulled out one final document, and I have this. A deathbed confession from Uncle Richard's former business partner, a man named Gerald Thompson who died 6 months ago from pancreatic cancer. Before he died, he gave a statement to his priest saying that Richard had confessed to him years ago about killing Margaret. Gerald kept quiet out of fear, but on his deathbed he wanted to clear his conscience. The priest came forward with the statement. Tears were streaming down my face. You did this. You actually did this. I told you I would. I promised I'd bring you home, and I'm keeping that promise. The next months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Ethan, now a practicing attorney, filed a motion to vacate my conviction based on newly discovered evidence. The district attorney's office fought it initially, not wanting to admit they'd convicted an innocent person, but the evidence was overwhelming and the media attention was intense. Local news picked up the story of the brother who'd become a lawyer to save his wrongly convicted sister. It became national news. Public pressure mounted. The motion was granted. My conviction was vacated pending a new investigation. I was released on bail after 8 years in prison, stepping out into a world that had moved on without me. Ethan was there waiting for me, now 22 years old, a grown man, and I barely recognized him. We hugged in the parking lot of Bedford Hills and I sobbed into his shoulder. You saved my life. You gave me my life back. You're my sister. I was never going to let you rot in prison for something you didn't do. The next investigation moved quickly. With all the evidence Ethan had compiled, detectives reopened the case with fresh eyes. They found things the original investigation had missed or ignored. Uncle Richard's stories about his whereabouts that evening had small inconsistencies that no one had caught because he'd seemed so credible and had such a solid alibi for the later time frame. They brought Uncle Richard in for questioning. He maintained his innocence at first, stuck to his story, but when they confronted him with all the evidence, the timeline issues, the suspicious financial activity, Gerald Thompson's deathbed confession, Mrs. Chen's testimony about the car, he broke down. He confessed, admitted he'd killed Margaret, said she'd given him no choice, that she was going to ruin him by reporting the embezzlement, destroy his reputation and his business. He'd gone to her house one more time that evening to beg her to reconsider, but she'd refused, said she'd already contacted her attorney and would be filing a police report the next morning. In a moment of rage and panic, he'd pushed her down the stairs, made it look like she'd fallen, then he'd calmly driven to his business dinner, establishing his alibi, and let the police investigation unfold, knowing they'd likely look at me since I'd been the last known person to see her alive by herself. He'd planted evidence. The carpet fibers on my clothes were actually fibers he'd placed there when he'd hugged me at a family gathering a week before the murder, knowing that if I visited Margaret's house, they'd find the fibers and use them as evidence against me. He'd manipulated the narrative through family members, dropping hints about my supposed greed, my supposed conflicts with Margaret. He'd played the grieving family member while letting his niece go to prison for his crime. The confession made national news. The case against me was formally dismissed. The prosecutor who'd convicted me, Douglas Freeman, faced intense scrutiny and criticism for the wrongful conviction. Uncle Richard was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and a host of other crimes. And I was free. After 8 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit, I was finally free. But freedom wasn't the triumphant moment I'd imagined. It was terrifying and disorienting. The world had changed. Technology had advanced, fashion was different, social norms had shifted. I'd gone to prison at 26 and come out at 34. 8 years of my life just gone. I'd missed my late 20s and early 30s, years when most people build careers and relationships and families. I'd missed the prime of my youth, locked in a cell. And my family was shattered. My parents, confronted with the reality that they'd abandoned their innocent daughter and believed their brother-in-law over their own child, were drowning in guilt and shame. They'd refused to visit me for 8 years. They'd testified against me. They'd chosen to believe I was a murderer rather than question the official narrative. And now they had to live with that. My mother tried to apologize, tried to rebuild our relationship. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have believed you. I should have stood by you. I failed you as a mother." I looked at her, this woman who'd given birth to me and raised me, and then abandoned me when I needed her most, and I felt nothing. No anger, no love, just emptiness. "You testified against me. You told the jury I was greedy and difficult. You let me go to prison while you went on with your life." I thought the evidence was overwhelming. You thought I was capable of murder, your own daughter. You believed a prosecutor you'd never met over the child you raised. She had no response to that. Neither did my father. The rift between us was too deep. They'd chosen their side and lived with that choice for 8 years. Discovering they'd been wrong didn't erase those years. But Ethan was there. Ethan, who'd sacrificed his adolescence and young adulthood to save me, who'd never doubted, never wavered, never gave up. He helped me adjust to life outside prison, helped me find an apartment, helped me figure out technology I'd missed, helped me navigate a world that had moved on without me. He also filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit on my behalf against the state and the prosecutor's office. The case was settled for $8 million, $1 million for every year I'd spent wrongly imprisoned. It was money that could never replace what I'd lost, but it gave me security and the ability to rebuild. Uncle Richard's trial was brutal. The prosecution brought all the evidence of his guilt, all the proof that he'd framed me. The defense tried to claim he was mentally ill, that the confession had been coerced, but it didn't matter. The jury convicted him on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life without possibility of parole. I attended that sentencing hearing, looked him in the eyes as the judge read the verdict. He'd aged in the year since his arrest, his hair gone gray, his face haggard. He looked at me and mouthed, "I'm sorry." I mouthed, "I hope you rot." The media called it a redemption story, the innocent woman freed by her devoted brother, the wrongful conviction overturned by determination and love. They made it sound triumphant and uplifting, but the reality was more complicated. I'd lost 8 years of my life, 8 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit, while my family abandoned me, and the real killer attended my trial and pretended to mourn his victim. 8 years of trauma that would take a lifetime of therapy to process. 8 years that changed me fundamentally, turned me from a carefree 26-year-old into a hardened 34-year-old who'd seen the worst of human nature. And Ethan had lost his adolescence and young adulthood to saving me. He'd missed proms and parties and normal college experiences because he was spending every spare moment investigating my case. He dedicated 10 years of his life to a single mission. He'd saved me, yes, but at what cost to himself? We talked about it once, about a year after my release, as we sat in my new apartment having dinner. "Do you regret it?" I asked, "giving up so much of your life for me?" He looked at me with surprise. "Regret it? Sarah, you're my sister. You were innocent and everyone had abandoned you. What was I supposed to do? Just let you rot in prison? Just accept that the justice system had failed and move on with my life?" "You could have. Most people would have. You were 12 years old. You could have believed what everyone else believed and lived a normal life. But I knew you were innocent. I knew it in my bones. And once I knew that, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't just go to college parties and worry about normal things while you were suffering for something you didn't do. Saving you wasn't a sacrifice, Sarah. It was the only thing that mattered." I started crying. "You gave me my life back. I can never repay that." "You don't need to repay anything. You're my sister. I love you. That's what family does. They show up, especially when everyone else walks away." That's the real lesson of this story, I think. Not the dramatic courtroom victories or the vindication or the exposure of the real killer, but the simple fact that one person believed in me when everyone else had given up. That one 12-year-old boy decided his sister was worth fighting for, and then spent a decade making good on that promise. I'm 34 now. I've been free for 2 years. I'm rebuilding my life slowly. Started a small graphic design business working from home. Go to therapy twice a week to process the trauma of wrongful imprisonment. Have a few good friends who've proven they'll stick around even when things are hard. Started dating someone who knows my whole story and loves me anyway. It's not the life I would have had if I'd never been convicted, but it's a life, and it's mine, and it's free. Ethan is 24 now. He has his own law practice, specializing in wrongful convictions. He takes on cases no one else will touch, cases where the defendant has no money and no hope, and no one who believes in them. He's everything I needed him to be for others who are where I was. My relationship with my parents is still strained. We talk occasionally, see each other on holidays, but the closeness we once had is gone. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. They chose not to believe me, and that choice created a distance I don't know if we can ever cross. But I have Ethan. I have the brother who never gave up, who kept his promise, who brought me home. And that's enough. Uncle Richard is in prison now, serving life without parole in the same system that held me for 8 years. The irony is not lost on me. Sometimes I think about him in his cell, experiencing what I experienced, losing his freedom the way I lost mine, and I hope he thinks about me every day. I hope he remembers the niece whose life he destroyed. I hope guilt eats at him the way injustice ate at me. But mostly, I just try to move forward, to build a future from the ruins of my past, to be worthy of the brother who gave up everything to save me. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry about the 8 years I lost. The answer is yes, every single day. I'm angry at a justice system that failed me so completely. I'm angry at a prosecutor who cared more about winning than about truth. I'm angry at family who abandoned me. I'm angry at everyone who looked at the evidence and decided I was guilty without ever really knowing me. But I'm also grateful. Grateful that Ethan never believed in me. Grateful that truth eventually won out over lies. Grateful that I got a second chance at life, even if it came 8 years too late. The wrongful conviction lawsuit settlement sits in my bank account. $1 million for every year I lost. No amount of money can give me back my 20s or erase the trauma of prison or rebuild relationships that were destroyed. But it gives me options, security, the ability to build something new. And Ethan? He refuses to take credit for what he did, always deflects praise by saying he was just doing what any brother would do. But we both know that's not true. Most brothers wouldn't dedicate a decade of their lives to an impossible mission. Most brothers wouldn't sacrifice their youth to save a sibling everyone else had written off. Ethan is a hero, my hero, the person who saved my life and gave me back my freedom. And every day I'm out of prison, living my life, I remember that I owe all of it to a 12-year-old boy who made a promise in a prison visiting room and then spent 10 years making good on it. That's the real story, not the wrongful conviction or the dramatic exoneration or the evil uncle who got what he deserved, but the simple, powerful story of a brother who loved his sister enough to move mountains to bring her home. And I'm home now. Finally, after 8 years in hell, I'm home.